Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from my office, and I hope that everyone's staying well and staying safe and staying healthy during very unusual and difficult times for all of us. We know that many people feel isolated and alone. They're observing social distancing, which is the right thing to do under these circumstances. So what better way to reach out and connect than to have this virtual class, which I hope gives us an opportunity to continue with our studies, and the added benefit of being able to play the class and learn at whatever time is convenient for you. So along with this video, I hope you've seen we're issuing the source sheet in case you misplaced it or in case you need one. So please follow along with me as we continue through the sources. As usual, I'll give you a bit of background and then we'll go forward with some of the material today. And this is certainly a more relevant topic than I thought it would be. We're realizing in the circumstances of the world today just how interconnected we are. Life itself is in many ways a team sport, more rowing than tennis. Please, if you have any questions on the material that we're reviewing today, don't hesitate to email me, rabbigrover@bethtikvahtoronto.org, rabbigrover@bethtikvahtoronto.org, and I can respond over email, and I'll give you my phone number as well in case a response would be better over the phone. I'd like everyone to learn as much as they would have as if we would have been in person, but we have the added challenge of me not being able to see you or hear your comments, so that's the way I thought I would deal with that. Just feel free to send me an email with questions or sections that I reviewed that perhaps need some more clarification. So let's begin with what we've learned already. Remember that we basically reviewed two different texts, which are stories from case law that are from two different sections of the Talmud, two different tractates of the Talmud. The first story comes from Masechet Eruvin, and it's a story about somebody who picks some figs from a tree and does not know if they've been tithed or not. And we reviewed in our first class the rules of tithing, and also how serious it is if you eat food that has not yet been tithed, because a portion of all of the produce that's grown in the land of Israel must go to the temple and to the priests. In other words, it belongs to God. And if you take some of that, you're stealing from the temple, you're stealing from God, and so the punishment is very, very severe for such a transgression. So we're trying to decide how a farmer who is called a chaver, and chaver is a word in the Mishnah that is supposed to mean an ideal Jew. What would we expect an ideal Jew, who's the farmer, he owns that fig tree orchard, what would we expect him to do if he finds that somebody took figs from the tree and forgot to ask him whether they were pre-tithed or not? So remember that there's a dispute between two rabbis. One rabbi says a chaver would certainly break a rabbinic law in order to save his friend from violating a Torah law. What are the specific laws in this instance? Well, there's a rabbinic law that says you only tithe from produce that is nearby the produce that you're eating from or taking for yourself. In other words, if you imagine a big, big orchard, if you're taking fruit from this section of the orchard, you can't take your tithe from another section of the orchard. That's a rabbinic law. You can only tithe from fruit that is nearby. I gave the example of going to Loblaws and you have apples that are organic in one section and apples that are non-organic in another section, you need to tithe from the organic apples if you took organic apples, and you have to tithe from non-organic apples if you took from non-organic apples. If you don't know which apples your friend took, you're violating a rabbinic law, potentially, if you take the wrong apples for the tithe. But Rabbi, remember, is Rabbi Judah the Prince, the editor of the Mishnah. So one of the most important features of what we call the Tannaitic period, the Mishnaic period, he says the chaver would violate that rabbinic law in order to save his friend from violating a Torah law. That's a very team mentality of Judaism. I violate a rabbinic law to save my friend from violating the more serious Torah law. And we would expect that owner of the orchard, if he was an ideal Jew, a good Jew, to take a tithe even from the wrong section of his orchard to save his friend from potentially eating the figs that would not have been tithed, which is forbidden according to the Torah. So that's the first case. Oh, and I should mention that even though Rabbi Judah the Prince says that's what an ideal Jew would do, there is a machloket, there's a dispute. And another rabbi, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, you can review this all, by the way, in the first page, on the first source. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel disagrees and says, no, an ideal Jew, the chaver, would not violate a rabbinic restriction in order to prevent someone else from violating a Torah restriction. That's a much more individual sport conception of Judaism. That's what Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says. Every man for himself. Do not violate a rabbinic law as an ideal Jew, even if it will benefit your friend. It's each man for himself. That's the first example. I did say last week that because Rabbi is a more important rabbi than Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, it's a weird word to use, important, but he is of higher status, can I put it that way? Because he's of higher status, Rabbi, we tend to look at that text as being a text that signals ideal Jewish behavior as helping your friend, even willing to sacrifice for your friend by yourself performing a sin in order to stop him from performing an even greater sin. Rabbi just has that seniority, I guess, in the ladder of rabbinic superiority. So that's the first text, Masechet Eruvin. Then a couple weeks ago we looked at a competing text from Masechet Shabbat. If you remember what happened there, I was staying over at my friend's house. I'm just giving you the familiar example. Someone was staying over at his friend's house, and when he woke up in the morning, he noticed that his friend put bread in the oven on Shabbat. The bread wasn't yet baked, but he saw, his friend went out for a walk, let's say, he saw that his friend made a mistake and inadvertently put bread, some dough, in the oven on Shabbat. And even though it's a rabbinic violation to remove that dough from the oven, right? The question is asked, should I'm the guest at his house, should I violate that rabbinic transgression and remove that dough from the oven before it bakes to save my friend from violating Shabbat, which is a Torah level, it's a more serious level sin, a Torah level sin, whereas just removing dough from the oven is just a rabbinic level sin. And if you remember, the one who says absolutely not at the end of that Talmud section, at the end of that Sugya is a section of the Talmud, his name is Rav Sheshet, And Rav Sheshet says, if you open up if you look at, this is page, let's see if you can see. It's hard to see with this camera, but I'm on page 2. At the bottom of the page, Rav Sheshet says, do we tell someone to sin so that his colleague can benefit? In other words, Rav Sheshet is appalled that I would even consider removing the dough from the oven. That would be a sin on my part, even though I'm helping my friend. The rule is we do not sin ourselves to help somebody else in any way. We don't sacrifice for the sake of our friend. Now, you see why this is now a competing text to the first text in Eruvin. Because Rav Sheshet is saying, no, you don't take the bread out of the oven. You don't take the dough out of the oven to help your friend. Whereas Rabbi, in the first text in Tractate Eruvin, is saying, yes, an ideal Jew does violate the rabbinic prohibition and tithes, even though he's not sure where the fruit came from. He still tithes to help his friend so that his friend does not violate the sin of eating untithed produce. So we have two texts that are competing with each other. In last class I said, what are we supposed to do? Who is right? It's not possible to say that maybe one text didn't know about the other text. They knew about each other. So there must be something about the specifics of the cases where one is different than the other, and that's why the rulings are different. So I asked everybody in class last week to look carefully at these texts, to think carefully about them, and to come up with your own ideas about what makes each case different. Last week, we looked at the first attempt by a medieval authority. The medieval authority that's quoted is in the Tosafot. We're on the top of page 3. Our first attempt to smooth out the differences between these two stories, these two tractates, the story of the fig tree orchard and on one side, and the story of the dough baking in the oven on Shabbat, which is the other story in Tractate Shabbat. Let's review on the top of page 3, the first source. In the case of Eruvin, we allow a minor transgression so that the Am Haaretz does not sin on the Chaver's account. But in the case of Shabbat, the forbidden act does not come about on his account, and therefore we do not permit even a minor sin to forego the other's violation of a major sin. This first attempt to resolve the differences by Tosafot picks up on a very specific matter in the case, in both cases, that is different. In Tractate Shabbat, the example I gave was I was just staying over at my friend's house on Shabbat. He put the dough in the oven. I had nothing to do with it. Because I had nothing to do with it, I shouldn't sacrifice and commit a rabbinic level sin in order to save my friends. In order to save my friend. It's his problem. He put the dough in the oven. He shouldn't have done it. I had no part in it. I should mind my own business. That's different than in the first story in Tractate Eruvin. In Tractate Eruvin, I told, if I'm the owner of the orchard, I told my friend to pick fruit from my orchard, to pick the figs from my orchard. It's true, he should have asked me, should I tithe? Have these already been tithed? It's true. But I could just as well have told him, be careful, I haven't tithed yet. You should tithe those figs. Or, it's okay, I pre-tithed these figs, you can eat them. The Tosafot here says, in the first case, both parties are involved, have agency in the series of unfortunate events. And because both parties have agency, the owner of the orchard, one of those parties, should sacrifice, should violate that rabbinic law, because he was at fault. Maybe not as much as the person who picked the fruit, but he still was involved in a much greater way than the Shabbat guest was involved in that second example. Because he was involved, he should violate the rabbinic law. That's why Rabbi says violate the rabbinic law. But in the Shabbat example, he wasn't involved. Mind your own business. You don't have to violate any law in order to save him. Okay, that's the first Tosafot. Now let's read as Tosafot continues to look at the differences between the text, what they think according to the opinion of Riva. So that's the second source on the third page. Riva, that's Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher, who lived in Germany in the 11th, 12th century. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Asher. What does he say? Riva says that one cannot use Eruvin as a paradigm for allowing the one who put the bread in the oven to remove it. In other words, the two stories are different. In Eruvin, the transgression has not yet been done, such that it is better to do a minor transgression to prevent the serious transgression from happening on his account. But in Shabbat, the forbidden action has already been taken and will reach its conclusion on its own. In that sort of case, we do not allow an active violation of even a minor prohibition. The Riva here sees another difference in the two cases. He looks at the Shabbat case, the dough in the oven, and says, you should also mind your own business in that case because your friend already sinned. It's true, the dough didn't yet bake into bread, but it will. And it's all his fault for putting the dough in. He set forward those events in motion himself. The sin is already done, right? The fact that it's not yet turned into bread isn't so important. It will in a matter of time. The sin has really already occurred. In the first case, in Tractate Eruvin, the sin has not yet occurred. Why? Because the person who came and harvested the figs didn't yet consume them. So the sin is one that you can prevent by tithing. If you don't tithe, he will sin. If you do tithe, he won't sin. In the Shabbat example, he already sinned. Whether you take the bread out, the dough out, or not, the conclusion of Riva is your friend already sinned in that example. It's a bit of a stretch, but this is an interesting close read of both examples, and you can make of it what you want. I think what he's saying is, if you can prevent a future sin, just the general rule is, if you can prevent somebody from sinning in the future, you should be prepared to sacrifice, be prepared to break even a rabbinic law. But if it's something that already happened, the series of events that led to this outcome have already for the most part occurred. You don't need to step in. You can just leave it alone. It's not something that you have to sacrifice for. That's the opinion of Riva. Now let's continue with the last source on page 3. It says another continuation of the Tosafot. Remember, the Tosafot, if you open up a page of the Talmud, you see on one side Rashi's commentary on the Talmud, and on the other side Tosafot's interpretation of the Talmud. The Tosafot are very famous for trying to make sure that there's harmony between all the sections of the Talmud. That's why we're looking at Tosafot. They're comparing the two texts and trying to make harmony between both of them. But the way the Tosafot do that is they often say, here's one way of making harmony, here's another way of making harmony, here's another way of making harmony. They don't pick very often one method of bringing harmony to the two texts, they'll throw out a bunch of different ways. So now this is the third way that Tosafot finds harmony between the two texts, by looking at them and saying they're different cases, really. Let's read what it says here at the bottom of page 3. An alternative resolution. Only when a person has acted badly, i.e. negligently, do we object that we do not tell people to sin so that others will benefit. In other words, as long as the person about to perform a major transgression has not already begun bad behavior, we would allow committing a more minor transgression to avoid them committing a more major one. This is really interesting. Here, Tosafot is making a judgment about the intentions of the parties in both cases. When they look at the story in Shabbat, the story of the dough, they really are not happy with this guy who puts the dough in the oven on Shabbat. He is negligent. And when someone acts negligently, you don't need to violate a rabbinic restriction in order to help them out, in order to save them from their sin. They should have known better. Let them suffer the consequences of their actions. In the first example, in Eruvin, the Tosafot says, it's not clear here that they acted negligently. And they say that because the farmer himself, while he is a chaver, he's an ideal Jew, right? He should have known better. The person who took the fruit, or who took the figs, he was an Am Haaretz. He was just a regular guy. He wasn't acting negligently in not asking whether the fruit had been tithed. He was just ignorant. He didn't know to ask the question. This is a really difficult and interesting also reading of what the intentions are of the parties. Sometimes I think we don't see the difference between ignorance and negligence. We think they're the same thing. But here the Tosafot ask us to reconsider that. Negligence means you should have known better. Ignorance means we don't expect you to know better. We should step in because we should assume you don't know better. Now, I really like this reading, even though it's challenging, because it says when you have another Jew who maybe doesn't know all of the rules, all of the specifics, you should be prepared to sacrifice on their account. Help them. Teach them what they should have known. Violate a rabbinic law on their behalf. They're part of your team, and when a teammate doesn't know better, you should be helping them out in a greater way. In Shabbat, it doesn't say that the friend that put the dough in the oven was ignorant. He could have been very, very smart. He just made a mistake. That's not ignorance, that's negligence. Should have known better, should have known it was Shabbat. And you don't need to step in a case like that. He will suffer the consequences of his negligence, and it's a good thing that he suffers the consequences of his negligence because he'll learn from it, he'll know better the next time. Ignorance and negligence are not the same thing. In Eruvin, the first case, it's an example of ignorance. And that's why we step in, we violate the rabbinic law to help the ignorant Am Haaretz who picked the fruit. In Shabbat, it's negligence. It's a guy who should have known better, and because of that, we don't step in. All right? Now let's continue. We have two more ways of smoothing out the two texts to look at. We're now on page 4. with the opinion of the Ritva. The Ritva is Rabbi Yom Tov ben Avram, who lived in Spain in the 13th, 14th century. Very famous medieval interpreter on the Talmud. What does the Ritva say? The Ritva says, the passage in Shabbat is in accord with Rabbi's view in Eruvin. Okay, he says both cases actually don't contradict each other. They're the same. Why? Shabbat is different. The court should not tell him to transgress, though it is fine if he does this himself, which is the case in Eruvin. That's really interesting. Another fine difference between the two texts. What happens in Eruvin with the orchard is a private matter. What we're ultimately debating in that text is, what ought a chaver to do? Using his own logic, thinking the case through in his head, would a chaver violate a rabbinic law, or would a chaver not violate a rabbinic law, even to benefit his friend and help him not transgress a Torah law? We're thinking about one person, how he would think, and how, therefore, an ideal Jew ought to think. What happens in Shabbat is different. The series of events that happens, the dough being placed in the oven, we're not asking what should the friend do. Should the friend remove the dough from the oven? If you read very closely the text, let's go back to page 2 and read closely the text. It's asked as a question. If one stuck breads to the sides of an oven, did they allow others to remove it? Who is they? Did they allow others to remove it? They is meant to mean, did the rabbis, did the court, did the official Jewish body allow the dough to be removed to save the friend from committing a Torah-level transgression? That's not a private matter. That's not what would a person think. That's what should a court rule. The case in Shabbat asks, what would a court rule in that example? Now, this is really interesting to me, too. I guess I keep saying this is really interesting, but they're all really interesting to me. When a court issues a decision, sometimes the court should come off more strictly because you're afraid that someone would use the court's decision in cases where that decision should really not apply. In a private matter, a person uses logic to make the right decision based on his beliefs, based on what he knows, based on the Judaism that he understands himself to observe. But in the case of Shabbat, we're asking the court to give an opinion. So when Rav Sheshet says, we don't ask somebody to violate a minor sin to save his friend from committing a major sin, he's saying the court should not issue such a statement. And that makes sense, right? Because if the court issues a statement and says, you can go ahead and violate all sorts of commandments as long as you have a reason to do so, that's a very dangerous thing. And people might take the court's ruling and apply it to situations where it really should not be applied. That's the sensitivity of the Ritva here in addressing this question. The Ritva says the court, because it's asked to rule in the case of Shabbat, is stricter. In Eruvin, the court's not involved. We're just asking, what would a person do? And in a specific case, a person can use his own logic and is not afraid that the way he resolves the situation will impact other cases in unintended ways. Okay, that's the Ritva. Interesting. And by the way, all of these examples sort of can apply to different examples in civic life and in rabbinic life as well today. There's some things I will tell people, I will counsel them privately in my office. You ought to do this or you ought to do that. But I would never make a public declaration that a person should do what I enabled them to do or what I helped them to do in the privacy of my office. There's some things you say privately, there's some allowances you make privately, and other allowances that you can make publicly. Let's look at now the last section on page 4. This is the Ramban. The Ramban, another Spanish authority known as Nachmanides, who lived in the 12th or 13th century. He says, "It is also possible that unintentionally sticking bread to the side of an oven is different because there is no real transgression, as he can receive atonement through a sin offering. Removing the bread thus only helps him to get exempted from a sacrifice." Ramban looks at the two cases and notices something else that's different. Look at all these close readers from the medieval period. In the case of Erevin, remember we said, if I, the person who took the figs home to my house, if I eat them and they were not tithed, I'm in big, big trouble. Eating untithed produce is a very serious violation in Jewish law. Maybe that's why Rabbi says the farmer should step in, violate the rabbinic law to help him, because the sin itself that I will have caused to occur is a very serious sin. But Shabbat, what are the consequences of putting dough in the oven without realizing that it's Shabbat? Well, it's not as serious a transgression. Why? Because it was done unintentionally. An unintentional violation of Shabbat, the penalty is a sin offering. In other words, you go to the temple, you pay some money, you buy an offering, and you place it on the altar, at least in the time of the temple. So in that case, all I'm doing by removing the dough from the oven is helping my friend avoid a financial loss. I'm helping him avoid the penalty that one incurs when a rabbinic violation, when a Torah level violation is performed unintentionally. So Ramban looks at the two cases and says they're fundamentally different. In Erevin, you're preventing him from the one who took the figs. You're preventing a very serious sin from occurring. In Shabbat, you're just helping your friend avoid a ticket, helping your friend avoid a sin offering. And in a case like that, you shouldn't help. You shouldn't sacrifice. He made a mistake. Many people make mistakes unintentionally. He should pay the price. He should make that sin offering. Don't get involved. And you don't violate a law on his behalf. This point is also made in the Sefer HaHashlama. Take a look at that. That's Rabbi Meshulam ben Moshe, who writes in Provence in the 13th century. Another explanation. One who sticks dough onto the side of the oven does not do the transgression himself. Rather, it happens on its own, and the only benefit that this person gets is that they will not have to bring a sin offering. If you notice, he's taking the opinion of the Rivah that we saw on the previous page. The Rivah says the sin already happened, right? It's going to happen anyway. And he's including that explanation in the Ramban's explanation, combining both together. In Shabbat, the sin already happened, A. And B, the only benefit that the person will get is that he won't have to bring a sin offering. It's a sin that can be easily mitigated. Just pay the money, bring the sacrifice, and your friend will be fine. We don't tell someone to sin so that his colleague will get monetary benefit, namely the cost of the sin offering. So in this example, it's about the consequences. Take a look at the consequences that will occur if you don't step in. In one case, if you don't step in, the consequence is severe. That's why Rabbi said a chaver ought to violate the rabbinic law. But in the Shabbat example, you're saving your friend from a monetary loss. That's not a severe consequence. Maybe to some people it sounds severe, but you have to understand in the Torah, consequences can get really severe. Stoning, and hanging, and all sorts of different terrible punishments that a person could get. Lashes. And in the scheme of punishments that a person endures, a monetary loss is not a significant one. And because of that, you shouldn't step in. There's no need to step in. But if you look carefully also at what's being implied, according to the Ramban and the Sefer Hashlamah here, they're basically saying you do have an obligation to sacrifice, to step in, to prevent a sin from occurring. If your friend is going to sin, and there's something you can do to stop it from happening, you should step in. But that is different than stopping a sin, or let me say, than stopping the penalty of the sin. Do you see the difference? In one case, you're stopping a sin from occurring, you should do that. But in the second case, in Shabbat, the sin has already occurred. All you're trying to do is to get your friend to avoid paying the money. You're not saving him from the sin. You're saving him from the consequences of the sin, from the penalty that he'll have to pay for the sin. And that's why there, the ruling is you don't step in. But in general, that text bolsters the opinion of Rabbi, who is the one who says Judaism is a team sport, and if your friend is going to sin and there's something you can do to stop it, you should step in, even if there's a violation of a rabbinic level commandment. So that really covers the first part of this class. Just as a review, we looked at two texts, the first one is from Tractate Eruvin, the story of the fig tree orchard. The second text was from Tractate Shabbat, the story of the dough on the oven. Both ruled differently about how much an ideal Jew ought to sacrifice to benefit his friend. We then looked at, I think, a total of six different opinions that try and smooth out the differences between the two cases so that they can both continue to stand independently, why the two cases are different, and therefore we rule differently. Now it's your choice who you think is right, whether you think this logic makes sense. Admire, if you would, the brilliance of the close reading of the case that each one of these medieval authorities does in order to arrive at their conclusion. In every case, both texts, both cases are able to stand independently because through their wisdom, the medieval authorities have separated them out and said they're different, and one implies a certain set of actions, and the other implies a different set of actions. And they demonstrate, I think, how complex and compelling the debate is between, to use the language from the first example, Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. How complex it is. It is not clear. I can't answer the question yet. Is Judaism a team sport or an individual sport? I've got some texts that are saying, yeah, but, and some other texts that are saying, no, it's not. There are dramatically different conclusions, practical conclusions, that have emerged from this discussion, from the different ways of resolving the dispute, or the different ways of resolving the contradiction that we've seen today. And those have major conclusions, major significance when we're asking how we ought to behave, but also what kind of community we ought to be creating together. So I hope that we can join together again next week for another round of this. Next week we're going to be looking at practical examples from Jewish life that have emerged throughout the ages. So far we've only been concerned really with 2 texts. But what I'd like to do next week is look at actual examples or more examples that have emerged at later times in Jewish history, where we've had to make decisions about how much to allow somebody to sin in order to help his friend. And one could certainly say that we're in a time right now. What are we dealing with right now? It's amazing how much this text has become relevant to us. When I told somebody we're not going to have services, they said, but I have to say Kaddish. And my answer is, I know you have to say Kaddish, but you're putting the health of the collective, the health of your friend, at risk by requiring minyanim to assemble so that you can say Kaddish. Here you have a rabbinic level or a custom of saying Kaddish, and also gathering together in a minyan, and we're trying to decide how much should the community sacrifice so that somebody can say Kaddish, or how much a person should sacrifice and not say Kaddish for the welfare of the community. Is Judaism a team sport? Is Judaism an individual sport? That question remains, my friends, unanswered. But I think already we've discovered that the richness of the question, the richness of the topic, and I hope to explore it further with you next week. Wish everybody a good day. I love learning with you today, and look forward to hearing some of your questions and comments over email. Again, it's Rabbi Grover at bethtikvatoronto.org. Be well.